Война – это мир, свобода – это рабство, незнание – сила.
If something is banned, that's where the freedom lies. If something is prohibited, it simply means that all the rest is up to you. You are free in your choice. And what is a human right? The rights limit your freedom. Hi everyone, it's a hot summer of 2022, and this is our reading club devoted to the more than just prophetic novel by George Orwell, 1984. 74 years after, this book not only hasn't aged, but it remains the bestseller #1. According to the Reading Chamber, only last year the number of the print run in Russia was 613,000. More often, only Stephen King is sold, and this is not surprising. Horrors by Orwell tickle the nerves no less, but they happen in reality. Big Brother, Arrest for Thought Crimes, and the Newspeak. Well, it's when instead of explosions we have some pops, and it's not the fall in the economy, but a negative growth. And of course, constant rewriting of the past. And all of us, just like the protagonist of the novel, are trying to understand whether the human spirit can resist the state machine. We talked about this with historians, biographers, journalists, and George Orwell's son Richard.
Задача новояза – сузить горизонты мысли. В конце концов, мы сделаем мысли преступления попросту невозможным. Для него не останется слов. Если есть слово «голод», зачем вам сытость? Не голод ничем не хуже. Даже лучше.
We are not at war with Ukraine or the Ukrainian people. We are conducting a special military operation against nationalists in order to protect the citizens of Donbass, denazification and demilitarization.
Newspeak, of course. Doublethink, of course. As one study shows, well, people say, who supports the war? I do not want the war. Everyone is against the war. But the special military operation I do support. And they do not realize that they say opposite things in one sentence. And they cannot behave differently. They have certain formulas in their heads, and so they need to find some way to talk about the certain things, but somehow not get accused of anything. Otherwise, it will just look bad. So, Newspeak. Do you have something like that in Belarus? Like, for example, today in Russia, the word war is prohibited.
No, Lukashenko, on the contrary, all the time pronounces the word war. He calls the war war. Just a couple of days ago, he was giving an interview to France Press, and he was saying that there is a war. So he allows himself to use this word. Although maybe next time when he travels to Russia, he will be arrested for that and hopefully be sentenced to 7 years in prison.
But I only now understood all the current propaganda techniques. About the fact that propaganda, the official propaganda, usually puts forward not only one official version of a particular event, but several at once. For example, concerning the plane that was shut down in 2014. First they said it was filled with corpses from the very beginning. There was such a version, or that it was shut down because they thought that the president of Russia was on the plane, and of course those were Ukrainians who did that. It seems so absurd. And why do they put forward so many different versions? Why do they do that? This is done so that people have the feeling. That is very often expressed by the phrases like, well, we will never know the truth. They have their own propaganda, we have our own propaganda, but we cannot know the whole truth. Everything is so unclear. How can we know the truth? And this is exactly what O'Brien wants in the novel. Why does he show all these 4 fingers or 5 fingers? And after the tortures, the protagonist tells him finally, 4, 5, I don't know, how much do you want? And O'Brien says, it's better now. Because the very abundance of these different interpretations of versions shows that supposedly no objective reality exists at all. Everything that you think is an objective reality, it's on your own mind. And how can one person so weak and so unwise know what is actually right? Only the party, as a collective body, only the party can give you a truly objective picture. And I saw this here in London in 2006, when Litvinenko was killed. A lot of people said, well, we cannot know the whole truth. And Vladimir Bukovsky, with whom I discussed this topic then, told me that this is a typical KGB trick. Either he stole a fur coat or it was stolen from him. No one knows the truth. It doesn't matter. A lot of information is created, and so the average person might think, well, should I really mess up with that? Should I really get involved? I don't know the whole story. I don't know what really happens there. I don't know the details. And it seems to me to be a very strong technique that is used today in order to affect the population. Therefore, the only thing that can help is the media. These are programs, these are articles, this is an explanation on what the things really are. No, guys, the truth exists. 2 plus 2 is still 4, and there is white and there is black. This phantasmagorical world, as Orwell said, in which yesterday's weather can be cancelled by today's decree. It can be resisted unless the whole world is poisoned by totalitarianism.
Узрите зло, творящееся с вами. Партия сбрасывает бомбы на своих же граждан. Все, что говорит партия, ложь. Партия хочет, чтобы вы верили в войну, дабы отвести от себя вашу агрессию.
Смерть предателю! Ненависть! Ненависть! Предатель!
And Orwell says that the most of party members should experience the following feelings. It's fear, it's hatred, blind admiration, and some sort of ecstatic delight. And I believe that this Crimea is back is absolutely about that. At first they scare people. Well, it's scary. There is some kind of a junta in Kiev. They crucified a little Russian boy. This was a show trial. They took a child of 3 years old wearing underwear. He was like Jesus, nailed to the board. One man held him and 2 were nailing. And people are really afraid. You immediately imagine those Soviet films with these scary fascists. And then suddenly there is a great victory. Crimea is back. Crimea is ours. And Orwell understood it very well. He saw this very well as a scientist, but at the same time as a writer, he could very, very accurately create the psychological state of a person, of course with the help of these outstanding images. And so he understood the role of victory in a totalitarian state. If you remember, Winston, the protagonist, smokes cigarettes called Victory, drinks cognac called Victory, and even the Trafalgar Square was renamed Victory Square. And this moment of triumph is extremely important, because these are very simple feelings: fear, hatred, worship of superiors, and then victory. Even insufficient enthusiasm when talking about victory, or let's say insufficiently enthusiastic facial expression, it's already a thought crime. And all 3 states that existed in the 1984's world, they were totalitarian, and they had more or less the same ideologies. But at the same time, Orwell writes that the authorities really didn't like when at least some casual contact with foreigners happened. Why? Because if you allow a person to contact with foreigners, he will find out that they are the same people, and the stories about them are mostly lies. This closed world in which people live will open.
Тоталитарное государство устанавливает неопровержимые догмы и меняет их изо дня в день.
Orwell wrote about how liberalism will lead humanity into a dead end. Orwell did not write about the Soviet Union. He wrote about the society in which he lived himself, and he wrote specifically about the collapse of liberalism. The press secretary of the Russian Foreign Minister, Maria Zakharova, recently said in her speech to reporters that, in fact, the novel 1984 tells us about what will happen to liberalism, and that if we go a liberal way, it will all end up very bad. Do you agree or disagree with her?
Skewing and twisting the truth is the whole essence of the novel and its characters. Maria, she simply had to try to find her own alternative answer to the question of what this book is really about. It's completely embarrassing for me to even say such a thing, but it's just nonsense. Dad tried to convey the idea that totalitarianism can be applied to anyone from any side, whether you are from the left wing or from the right wing, or even if you're not interested in politics at all. Any person can get affected by dictatorship. And there is no difference for the ordinary person, let's say for the man in the street, if the dictatorship is right or left. Well, I would prefer not to argue with this woman. Is it the one from the Ministry of Truth? In general, the adventure of the word liberalism is interesting and important because now the main confrontation in the world is the confrontation between liberal and anti-liberal capitalisms. And when Nursultan Nazarbayev was still president, he wrote an article where he said that we defeated the three main evils of the 20th century. It's fascism, communism and liberalism. And that means that he put them all in one line. And now we can see that there is a continuation of this rhetoric when liberalism is put in this line and equated to it. And this is similar to when we hear about this Nazification of Ukraine, demilitarization. This is an attempt to insert the current situation into that context, into the context of the fight against fascism and Nazism.
Мысли преступления — смерть. Оно не чревато смертью. Оно само смерть.
So, in your opinion, how well Orwell described the totalitarian regime?
Well, when I first read this book, it was, I think, in 1984 actually, and I was completely struck by the moment with cigarettes. It is when the protagonist takes out a cigarette from the package and the tobacco always falls out. I was already smoking at that time. And I knew that Soviet cigarettes are all the time bad. They are always kind of wet and they need to be dried and kneaded somehow. Well, clearly the author was thinking of some kind of a world of evil, but there seems to be some kind of connection that something must be bad in this world. How it could be predicted, be seen like that, it really struck me. He predicted very well the world that was built by Soviet regime.
So to what extent is the totalitarian regime interconnected with a bad economy?
This is a very interesting question. In the 20th century, it turned out to be more often interconnected. We kind of know that the German totalitarian regime was not arranged in such a way that it was much more solid in terms of the economy. As for the Soviet regime, it was all quite interconnected. On the one hand, the USSR looked like such a civilized country in terms of military technology, for example, but in terms of agriculture, for example, it was more like a third world country. If it's not a good year, then we are all starving. It's not like hunger, but there is noticeably less food. When a consumer boom arose in the United States, for example, they found a way for the economy to exist when people consume and the economy grows from this. And people feel good and the economy is developing at the same time. In the USSR, they completely failed to do this within the framework of that regime. And in fact, it was precisely because of that that the regime later collapsed. But today we see a different collision. Nowadays, it's not like what is described by Orwell. Today, this is not a confrontation between capitalism and socialism, but this is a confrontation between two capitalisms, of liberal and anti-liberal capitalism, the flagship of which is China, and where Russia belongs to. These are authoritarian systems. They also try to control the ideology of people, their thought crimes. The paradox is that you have the same thing, the same 2 minutes of hate, but then in your free time, you can go and sit in some modern loft, in a comfortable modern bar, connect the Wi-Fi, eat I don't know what.
Foie gras and oysters.
Anything. You can eat and feel like there is no difference between like if you were sitting in New York or London. And these new authoritarian regimes said goodbye to socialism. They took some development mechanisms from capitalism, and today they buy loyalty by increased consumption. Not only by the punishments and repressions, which they also still do, and not only with the media control that they widely use, with the censorship, but also with the well-being that will be available to you if you completely agree with this all and will fit into all this system with 2 minutes of hatred, brainwashing and all this stuff. All this you must accept, and then you will have super consumption and live like an Englishman.
I'm always trying to calm myself down that, well, despite such an authoritarian regime and despite the fact that there is propaganda, the Ministry of Truth and everything else, our people still understand everything and they read a book at home under the pillow. Is it like that?
Well, it seems to me that in general, Russian society, especially its young generation, they are quite intellectual. And this is an anomaly for me, what is happening now in Russia. I believed in our society, but there are some factors that work against us and that every time send Russia back into this world of anti-liberalism and this kind of authoritarian state. But even now I see that there is some kind of internal struggle between the two Russias. And I see in this war, what is happening now, that this is also part of this internal struggle. Therefore, it doesn't surprise me that people read this book, because I know in Russia there is a society for which this is normal, right? For them, it's their civilizational horizon. This is a normal society in its normal state.
Orwell said, the organized lies used by totalitarian states are not, as it is sometimes said, a temporary measure of the same kind as a military strategy. It enters in the very essence of totalitarianism, and it doesn't disappear, even when the need of concentration camps and the secret police disappears. And that's why the system of organized lie is the Orwell's main feature of totalitarianism. He's even ready to understand the secret police or concentration camps. That's not what he's talking about. He says that you can bring people to such a state when all this is no longer needed. And then he says a terrible phrase. He says, well, you must understand that the way you can breed a herd of hornless cows, so you can breed a kind of people who have no need in freedom.
Do you predict the future of Russia more looking Orwell style? That's when you have bad cigarettes, bad economy, bad coffee, and all this stuff. Or still, if we follow the Chinese way, then we will have a good economy.
I don't think Russia will have a good economy. And yes, it will rather be closer to Orwell. Although, well, as if no one will probably build such a completely Stalin-type mobilization model, and therefore it will look completely different. But such degradation in consumption, degradation in the quality of life, it seems inevitable to me. And the country is undergoing demodernization. We kind of throw away the modernization potential of the country. We refuse it, and we switch to the economy that we might have had 15 years ago. Here we are, an upper middle income country by GDP per capita, and we sort of descend to the level, from a technological point of view, to the level of low middle income countries. And these countries, they simply have less money, so they can't buy as much imported technology. They develop more slowly on old equipment, on some old stuff, old technologies. But we went there voluntarily. We just went downstairs, tuk. I have had an experience. I traveled through whole Albania by taxi, and when you enter the country, first thing that surprises is a huge number of car service stations. Every 500 meters or 1 kilometer you can find one, the big ones, and you drive an old car and all the time repair it. The whole country is all the time involved in the repairing of old cars, and we will face a similar situation. We voluntarily go 20-30 years back now.